Hi and welcome to this latest edition of Inside MLCSU. I'm Richard Caddy and today we're talking about the Clive Treacey Independent Review. If you don't know about that, if you haven't heard of it, this is a brief overview.
The Clive Treacey Independent Review was commissioned following his death in 2017. To his family, Clive was a loving, funny, ambitious, talented person who wanted to play a positive part in society and live an independent life. But, to a flawed system, he often seemed more like a problem that was too difficult to fix. Clive was diagnosed with epilepsy at the age of 8. He also had a learning disability. His epilepsy was complex, and to people who didn't know and love him, seemed to be his defining characteristic. He was moved frequently between residential establishments, as each one decided in turn his care was too hard for them to deal with. Clive had his own ideas about how he wanted to live, and his family always supported him, but they were often ignored. He was deprived of his liberty, supposedly for his own good, for the last 10 years of his life, because of a lack of services to support him in the community. He remained institutionalised because there wasn't any attention to getting him out until the last year of his life. Over this period, both his mental and physical health deteriorated. Yet, when he died in a treatment centre in 2017, at the age of just 47 following an epileptic seizure, his family were told his epilepsy wasn't even a contributing factor, nor were the multiple occasions on which he had been failed and chances had been missed to help him live the life he wanted and deserved. This led to the family campaigning for an independent review of Clive's life and his death. It was a campaign that was eventually successful. This is Clive's story, and now it is hoped it will lead to people in a similar position to Clive being treated differently.
And today I'm joined by Beverley Dawkins OBE, the independent chair of the review, Hafsha Ali, MLCSU's managing consultant for digital transformation and transforming care, and a special guest, which is Elaine Clarke, who's Clive's sister. Elaine, first of all, could you tell us a bit about Clive's childhood, please?
I'd love to. He was always laughing, he was always singing, he was always running. He was just driven with such excitement for life. What I'll never, ever be able to describe is Clive's determination that those days that I consider to be his suffering, he never let them get in his way. He is so driven. And
he was a talented lad, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. Clive was an incredible artist. He had many talents and gifts. His biggest gift was his heart. It knew no bounds.
His epilepsy was eventually diagnosed, though, wasn't it? And did that have an impact on his education?
So around the age of 8, his seizure activity that was recognised to be potentially seizure activity started to dominate. There was an admission at the age of 8 to a local hospital, and a gentleman there considered Clive to have epilepsy. And from that diagnosis, I'll be very frank with you, Clive went to the same primary school as the rest of us. He followed us to our secondary education school. But in the first 12 months of Clive's education, due to the overbearing risks they were presented with, he was excluded from mainstream education despite academically achieving that position. And that was because of stairs.
The fear he might fall down.
Yes,
yeah.
They felt that they couldn't accommodate Clive's lessons on the second floor, which was quite shocking as an adult, as I've come to truly understand what that meant and the change. And, that caused Clive in his life is that nobody had any foresight or ambition to educate Clive on the ground level.
Right, okay.
All of the accessible, from music, from cooking,
something
to
that
woodwork,
seems so simple.
we all accessed on the ground floor, and all of these things and everything, Clive had equal passions for, as we all did.
So I think that eventually led to him being admitted to a school for children with learning disabilities.
Yes, it did. Clive entered a school, as you rightly say, for other pupils in Clive's position, and greater needs, and that school, I have to say, I took great pride in sharing that with the review, just the sheer scale and lengths they went to, and how Clive's quality of life and education thrived. But the most important thing I remember about Saxon Hill, is the school he went to, is that Clive came to the age of 16. He'd achieved so much in such a short space of time within that environment, given the skills of the staff. He came to 16, which meant his education was going to conclude. And Clive just had an overriding desire to continue in education, secondary to a college. He saw a college for himself because he saw his other siblings heading that direction. So Saxon Hill actually agreed with the local authority to keep Clive on despite his education finishing at that point of his 16th birthday, till Mum and Dad find an appropriate college that could accommodate Clive's desires and his epilepsy.
But that went quite a journey.
Absolutely. That was the first time in Clive's life that, he left home.
Yeah.
He left home, absolutely. The distance was never too great for Mum and Dad and the rest of the siblings in the van that used to go to him. But that distance, let me be very honest, it caused more upset for Mum, Dad and the rest, us ourselves than it did for Clive. He ran and he never looked back. He knew exactly what he wanted.
But he then continues his education, but after that, his illness was becoming more of a barrier.
Yes.
But he'd still got ambitions in life, hadn't he?
Absolutely. As you rightfully say, Clive's epilepsy and his learning disability, they never defined Clive, and Clive never recognised them. Clive saw no barriers. So, that brought Clive some challenges and many encounters, because it was always externally saw, never internally driven. So, but yes, it came to a point where Clive started to experience some restrictions that he couldn't understand and he wasn't prepared to accept.
After college, though, Clive then went through a series of placements in various establishments,
Yes.
all of which seemed to, at one point or another, for one reason or another, wash the hands of him. Beverley, can you tell me, I counted up 16 different placements from the review. That seems extraordinary. Should that happen?
Well, it certainly shouldn't, but sadly, based on experience of working with people with learning disabilities for many years, it's all too common. One thing seems to lead to another, but it is an extraordinary number of placements, and it's not acceptable.
And it seems that he did become defined by a lot of the places where he lived by his illness, rather than Clive, the individual with hopes and ambitions. And I mean, sometimes he was moved because they couldn't cope with his illness. Mm-hmm. In probably his happiest placement, I think he was eventually moved after 4 years because there was a row over funding, wasn't there, Elaine?
Yes, that's right. Clive did find the very thing he desired in life, which was the same as we all do. To have his own home, a pet. He was very spiritual, so the fact that there was a church next to his property, and he could attend his Sunday service, he had access to college, he had access to a job, his dream job, gardening. So, yes.
And that crashed and burned because basically over a squabble over cash, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Clive, unfortunately, yet again found himself between that scrap, and that was a line down the middle of two boundaries. So Birmingham and Staffordshire, unbeknownst to us at the time, had already made a decision to fight over funding, and neither one would support funding, given the success that Clive was having in life. He was abruptly removed from his home life he'd ever felt was his home.
In Hafsha, some of the places where he was accommodated were really totally unsuitable, weren't they? In some places, he was sent for short-term assessments and ended up staying there months or even years.
So I think when we first met, I can't remember, Elaine, quite exactly the phrase, but you talked about there was no plan ever. It was always just trying to get from one place to the next. Commissioning organisations, so the organisations that are responsible really looking after Clive and making sure that his ambitions are achieved, didn't really know Clive, didn't understand Clive and didn't understand his needs. So actually what he did was he just ended up in the next available place, going from place to place.
And that does come across from the report, doesn't it? That no single one person ever seemed to take responsibility for him.
And that's
and understand him.
Exactly, and I think that's often quite common and is exacerbated actually when people are moved from a distance, a great distance. So Clive, not unusually, like many people like Clive, most of his life he spent, miles and miles from home. And in fact, when we see, there was a time when he came back to Staffordshire because your mum brought him back, didn't she, to live with him. And at that point, he was supported by a social worker locally. And that was probably one of the few examples of where there was a social worker, I think it was an epilepsy nurse, wasn't it?
Yes.
That really got to know Clive.
Yes.
And the reason why I was kind of quite taken by Elaine when she was describing all of this detail to us is because often when we look at lots and lots of stories like Clive's in the work that we do, there's always a feeling of inevitability. His, given the Clive, his health conditions, his needs, it's just going to be too difficult to find places that are going to be able to support him. But we know from Clive's story, and Elaine was really clear about those, there were lots of great examples of where it absolutely was possible.
Mm.
Yeah, they really showed that he could have lived the life that he describes so vividly to everybody so often. And that's, I suppose, almost the saddest part of this story.
That every time he sort of got some stability, he just drifted on to the next place.
Yes, and how he got lost as a person. I think one of the things Hafsha and I found when we started to draw down, as you can imagine, the volumes of records and reports and notes about Clive, was rather than this amazingly talented, creative person you just heard Elaine described, he was a sort of series of labels and conditions. And I think one of the first things I said about starting to read the notes was, Clive Treacey's missing. Who actually was he as a person? Because you couldn't find him in his records.
And it's not as if he had he lacked advocates because his family were with him all the way, weren't they?
We was, yes. Mum and Dad, Mum and Dad never let their child go, and they never stopped seeking and supporting Clive's own ambitions for the life. We were all treated equally. We all had the same desires, and they made sure that nobody treated Clive's any differently. Mum and Dad understood that their voices were also not being heard and that they were being lost in their ability to assist Clive. So to manage Clive's own voice, they opened their door to their hearts to let Clive himself make his own choice, and they fought, secured and had longevity for Clive to have his own independent advocate that stayed with him for over a decade. Unfortunately, within this process and the journey that he experienced, even the advocate lost a voice in being able to assist Clive appropriately at times.
Okay, now Clive had epilepsy. It was getting increasingly severe, but he had other health problems as well. There's something in the report about something called diagnostic overshadowing, where it seemed that every problem with Clive's health was just met with a shrug of the shoulders, and it's it's all down to epilepsy, isn't it? Could you tell us a bit about that, please, Beverley?
Yes, unfortunately, it's one of the things that has been established for very many years that happens to people with a learning disability. So people's often can be quite severe medical conditions, can be not diagnosed very promptly because people are seeing those symptoms as part and part of their learning disability or part and part of a condition like epilepsy.
I think the most striking example of that was, it happened in his 20s, didn't it? That was he'd been lying down in a dark room and everybody said, it's epilepsy, and he turned out to have a brain tumour.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that, is probably the most powerful example. So, again, sadly, that situation isn't uncommon, where there's an incredible kind of delay where people are putting symptoms down to another cause. And in this case, this was a brain tumour.
Yeah.
And that was added to by also some, big administrative delays as well. So, he gets a very late diagnosis of a brain tumour that was obviously causing him great distress, which I think probably in almost any other person would have been established far sooner.
We always questioned it, given Clive's light sensitivity and the sheer pain and screams he used to make if you opened a curtain. So Clive was sent for an MRI and the test, but it sat on somebody's desk for a month, and it was only at the hands of somebody else taking the duty files that we got that emergency call.
We recently did a podcast about deprivation of liberty, and for some people it's necessary, but it wasn't to Clive, because it then led to him spending 10 years in a hospital setting, basically.
I think the view is, and I'm certainly no expert, I'm not a clinician, but it's all about understanding people and understanding people's needs. So to deprive someone of their liberty, we need to understand quite clearly the basis for doing that. And in Clive's case, Clive never had any diagnosed psychiatric illness. He never had any...
He was challenging, though, wasn't he, at times?
There were behaviours that led him to go into hospital for a short period of assessment and treatment. So as far as I understand it, and Elaine, do correct me, but Clive suffered from support needs, actually, from having gone through quite a lot of trauma in his life up until the point in which he went into hospital. The fact was that actually nobody really understood what those needs were. And in today's world, we do lots of work to identify when people's needs start to escalate early on. And although we've got a long way to go, we've got a better chance of identifying those needs and getting support wrapped around people. Now, Clive never had that. Should he had that, if people really understood him better, at some point there was almost thought of, could he be autistic? And that was never looked into. If we'd understood all of those things, he may never have got anywhere near a hospital. So the point is, I think, that actually, if we'd understood his needs better, I'm not sure he would have ever needed to have had his liberty deprived. And often what we say in the work that we do now is, well, actually, on the day when someone gets sectioned, when an incident happens, and actually Clive's case wasn't straightforward at all in this way, so I wouldn't put Clive in this category. But let's say a situation gets to a point where we're in crisis and it is not safe to, and it's necessary for the safety of the individual or the person to be detained. That has to happen. But the truth of it is, at that point, that is necessary. But what would have happened a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves. At that point in time, it's too late.
So for the last 10 years of his life, he moved from one hospital setting to another until he eventually arrived at his final home, if you could call it that, which was in Nottinghamshire, where it was hoped he could undergo a period of rehabilitation that would allow him to get back into the community. But really, things drifted from bad to worse. There were problems transferring records, there were inadequately trained staff, there was equipment that was essential to his health that was broken and not fixed.
It certainly felt like it was chaotic, because I think the lack of attention to his health needs stands out. So at this point, when you're looking at somebody who's got complex epilepsy, and as we understood from the experts we involved in the review, that he was actually someone at high risk of sudden death in epilepsy, and yet in this setting he's not being recognised as that. And so what you can't see is how people were ready to manage that situation effectively. So, as things deteriorate, and there are a number of factors which are heightening his risks, such as the way he put on lots of weight, the fact that his CPAP machine was broken and out of action. That
helped him sleep. He'd got sleep apnea, so he couldn't sleep properly without this machine.
So, critical things, the fact that he was occasionally refusing epilepsy medications, and that wasn't going to escalated appropriately within the organisation. So you've got a number of things happening at the same time, leading to this awful night where he has the major seizure that eventually led to his death.
So Clive died on January the 31st, 2017, and again there are a series of problems that went on, including staff who'd undergone the mandatory training but to resuscitate somebody, but had never ever actually had to do it in real life. and the report does. I won't go into. I know you've spoken about this on many occasions, Elaine, but we won't go into details. People can read the report, but again, it's just. It's never one thing, is it? It's always a combination of things going wrong at the same time.
That's right. And I mean, I think I say in the report, I don't think any family should ever have to listen to an ambulance call centre recording, you know, of the last minutes of their relative's life. But, you know, we listened to that recording too. And I guess it then just highlighted the sort of, you know, chaos, the, you know, lack of being prepared for that eventuality from those staff. And I sat and counted the minutes, you know, and I knew from my own first aid training that, you know, these guys are running out of time as they didn't know the postcode of the facility to give to the ambulance crew, as they, you know, unfortunately didn't place Clive on the floor to, you know, do CPR, as they couldn't, you know, locate the defibrillator very quickly. All of those minutes are ticking by, and you can't help but think, you know, was there yet an opportunity when Clive's life could have been saved? And you listen to that just slipping away from the people who were present. It's an awful thing to listen to.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there for the moment, but we'll be back shortly when we'll talk about events that happened after Clive's death. Thank you.
Still to come in the next episode.
The autopsy result was something of a bombshell to the family, wasn't it, Elaine?
The pathology guidelines were not followed in Clive's death. I just went into protection mode and did what I'd always done for Clive, Mum and Dad.
If you would like to know more about Midlands and Lancashire Commissioning Support Unit, go to our website mlcsu.co.uk.